Welcome to Firearms Friday, coming to you from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne. I'm Evan Green. I am the firearms historian for the museum, and since I've about finished looking at the 300 firearms in the museum's collection, I've been asked to move on and do some research on the edged weapons, swords, bayonets, that are in the permanent collection. And this is a pretty interesting one. If you've seen the video on the 1860 cavalry officer's sword, it's a marked contrast in that shiny scabbard and with the gold or bronze brass fittings. This is a real contrast. This is an 1913 cavalry sword. And it was designed in part by George Patton when he was a lieutenant in the American cavalry. And George Patton, you know, went on to become a four-star general in World War II. He was participated in World War I and was wounded in World War I, and was an accomplished swordsman. He participated in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, which included horsemanship, running, swimming, pistol shooting, and swordsmanship. And he placed 5th overall behind the Swedish national pentathlon team. And he became quite good friends with the members of that team and reunited with them at points in the future. And he thought that he should have placed higher because he challenged the interpretation of his pistol target. And he claimed that at least one, if not two, of his shots went through the same holes that were already in the target, and they should have been scored that way. I scored a lot of pistol targets over the years when I was actively competing in that discipline, and it is very rare for a bullet to go through the same hole without leaving some trace that it has done so. But anyway, Patton was born into a family that had money. He married into a family that had a lot of money. So that enabled him, as a young lieutenant in the United States Army, to buy a motor car and to maintain a string of polo ponies. When he was transferred to Hawaii, he bought a yacht on the East Coast, had it shipped to San Francisco, and sailed it to Hawaii. He was not hurting for money. And that freedom that money provided enabled him to make several trips to Europe and study swordsmanship under some of the French masters. So he was quite accomplished as a swordsman, and in fact, at the time he participated in the design of this sword, he was the master of the sword at the United States Cavalry Academy. Make sure I've got that name right. Yeah, he was written by Master of the Sword, Lieutenant General George Patton, Jr., for use with the 1913 Cavalry Saber. Master of the Sword as a young lieutenant. So this is called a saber, even though it has a straight blade. And normally, any sword with a straight blade is not a saber. This is the exception because it was associated with the cavalry, and the cavalry uses sabers. So it turned out to be called a saber, even though technically it is a straight sword. And this saber exercise book, this is a reprint, but it is very detailed in how to use a sword on foot or in horseback. And George Patton was an interesting guy in many ways because he was in that transition period between swords and firearms as the primary sidearm on a battlefield. That transition for the United States pretty much started with the Civil War, when swords were still a big thing. There were more swords made in the United States between 1861 and 1866 than were made in combination before and after. But the sword as a close combat weapon in the Civil War were slowly replaced by repeating firearms, and in particular repeating revolvers, the Colt, the Remington, and others that were used in that period of time. And also Patton was in that, again, that awkward transition between the horse cavalry and a motorized armor, motorized units. Even in the 1913s, and even after World War I, there were old hidebound cavalry guys who said, we got to have horses and swords. Well, that didn't work out too well in World War I when you're facing barbed wire machine guns. But again, Patton, really an interesting guy, and survived that transition by treading very carefully not to offend the old cavalry guys while still advocating in many ways for new battlefield tactics and new battlefield equipment and the abandonment of the horse for armor. So, great sword. This is, again, it's not very pretty. It really expands the initial use of swords that were always, from the Bronze Age 5,000 years ago, intended only for the killing of other human beings. Knives, axes, spears had other functions. The sword was always a killing instrument. And this one, the really basic, brutal appearance of this to me really underlines that. It's got an interesting dent in this knuckle bow right here, which I wonder about how that happened. And was this ever actually used in combat? I would guess not. Somebody dropped it in the barracks. So one of the interesting things about this Patton sword, this model of 1913, has to do with the guy who donated it to the museum, which was another George. It was a guy named George Guy. Now, George Guy graduated from the University of Wyoming Law School in 1927. In World War II, he was attached to the Judge Advocates Division or organization. And after the war, he was selected to be on the defense team for the trial of a Japanese general, General Yamashita, who was tried for war crimes. And certainly the Japanese did some horrible things during World War II. The specific incident that triggered this trial was the action that some Japanese Marines took when the United States was on the verge of retaking the Philippines. General MacArthur's famous, "I shall return," and he's going to wade ashore for a photo op on the Philippines. But as the United States appeared poised to retake the Philippines, this group of Japanese Marines just ran amok in Manila. They killed civilians. The most perhaps egregious event was they went into a military hospital and executed both Filipino and American prisoners of war who were in that hospital, and killed other prisoners of war. So even though Yamashita was thousands of miles away when that happened, and may in fact have been more directly responsible for other incidents, he was tried and convicted and eventually hanged for war crimes. And George Guy was on his defense team. When the results were in and Yamashita had been convicted, he very graciously thanked all the members of his defense team and distributed his remaining personal effects. And George Guy received a cap, a Japanese cap, and the megaphone that Yoshimitsu had used to address his troops. And those are in the collection here at the museum and currently on display in an exhibit called The Ghosts of War. So George Guy, kind of an interesting person. There's nothing in the record about how he acquired this sword. He also donated a Japanese bayonet that I had some trouble identifying. Was able to find it eventually. But a lot of the other stuff that George Guy, donated to the museum had to do with polo, because he was the founder of the Cheyenne Polo Club. So there's mallets and balls and trophies and newspaper articles and all sorts of things about the Cheyenne Polo Club. And George Guy was apparently an active participant, although I was unaware that such a thing existed. And as I mentioned earlier, kind of the connection that ties it together is he donated this Patton sword, and Patton was also a polo player and had a string of polo ponies. So